Good morning. It is Monday. We have now finished the chapter on quadratic equations. You took the test. Most of you have done well. And those of you who, nobody failed, but those of you who struggled with a portion of it, because this is being taught online, I'm going to give you a chance to do just a few corrections on some problems just to make sure that you've mastered it. Not the whole test, but just some portions of it, I'm going to give you a chance to do some correcting. So we're now transitioning from quadratic functions to square root functions. And, if we remember all of the functions we have done linear functions. We also did absolute value functions, exponential functions. Obviously, we looked at quadratic functions. We're going to do square root functions. And at the very end, we're going to do rational numbers, and we're going to look at hyperbolas. All right, square root functions. So we have to start with some terminology. And the first one, and you can see this in your book, a radical expression. Now, if you remember, an expression is not an equation. It contains usually a number, right? We've said, and operators. And if it's a variable expression, algebraic expression, it contains a variable. A radical expression is an expression which contains a radical. Now, a radical can be a square root, but it can also be a cubed root. So a radical is square root, where there's sort of a 2. We don't usually write it, but it's kind of understood. A cubed root, a fourth root, etc. A radical function is a function which contains a radical expression in the radicand. In other words, the x or the y or whatever variables inside the square root. So that is a radical function. This is a radical function. This is a radical function. Okay, because each of them is in the square root. Actually, and let me just throw in a cubed root here, just so we're still just talking about radicals. When we talk specifically about a square root function, a square root function is essentially when you're talking about a square root. In other words, where there's a little 2, right? So this is a square root function, okay? Because you will at some point look at cubed roots and have different graphs than square root. So just looking at the parent square root function, it looks something like this. And I have given you a link to some Khan Academy videos that can also introduce you to the square root functions that are fantastic to look at, because they look at everything. They look at, they introduce you to, they go back to parabolas and they connect it to square root functions. So just to let you know, a parent square root function looks something like this. This is the y equals square root of x. Remember, the parent function is the simplest possible version of the square root function. Just like the parent function for the quadratic equation was the simplest possible version of the quadratic. The parent function is y equals square root of x, and that is what a square root function looks like. The book does not do this, but just to give you a sense for how the function gets that shape, I'm going to find the xy values over here. And we're going to start with 0. 0, if x is 0, y is 0. If x is 1, y is 1. So far it starts looking like a parabola, right? Now, what's really important about a square root function is you know that the square root of 1 is both equal to +1 or -1. We only choose the positive square root. Okay? We do not do the negative square root. So let's keep going, and I'm just going to make it easy for myself. If x is 4, y is 2, and that's going to be here. Okay? Oops, sorry. I meant to write 2 over here. Okay, so that is what the parent function looks like, and just as with all the other functions, I'm going to go into what happens when we start multiplying this by a number. What happens when we add a number inside the radical like we do here? What if you add one on the outside of the radicand? And we're going to see what happens to the square root function, and you're going to see that exactly just as we did with the parabola, with the exponential equation, with the linear equation, something's going to move it up, something's going to give it a stretch, something's going to give it a shrink, and you're going to see the exact same pattern. You are now used to it, so it's a pretty easy chapter actually.